fishing electronics. I'm Chris Hearn. I'm the West Tennessee field rep for the Tennessee Wildlife Federation. Grew up over here in West Tennessee and spent a lot of time fishing on Kentucky Lake, which is really known for its offshore fishing where you're really utilizing your fishing electronics. So really learned a lot over the years and look forward to sharing with you guys some of the basics of using your fishing electronics. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in tonight's class. You know, fishing electronics is a very generalized term for all the different things and depth finders and graphs and things that can be found on boats today, but it's come a long ways over the last 50 years. And we're going to kind of talk about the humble beginnings of what fishermen were using years ago and kind of where we are now. We're going to talk about all the different types of fishing electronics and their uses. And then we're also going to talk a little bit identifying what you're looking at and applying it to your everyday fishing. So ask away as we get to these different subjects, and hopefully I can answer any questions you have as well. But yeah, I mean, we have come a really long ways as far as the development of fishing electronics, and the first real fish finder was developed in about 1948 by the Furuno brothers. They'd done some commercial fishing for sardines, and one of the brothers thought, man, to be able to track these schools of sardines way off the coast, it'd be nice to have some way of finding them. And basically, they developed some of the first fish finders, which still the principle applies today. You know, you're just throwing different radar sonar beams down there, and the reflection is coming back to a device that measures it. And, you know, everything was built off of that. And then you look forward into the 70s and 80s, and my uncle and some of my people I've really learned a lot in the fishing world from, you know, they used paper graphs back then. And still to this day, you know, they can show you some of the paper reels that were fed into those graphs that they used, you know, and that was top of the line in the day. And then you fast forward to where we are now, and you're looking at touch screen graphs that's, you know, 18, 20 inches in size, and you can split all these different applications off on them. And, you know, it's only getting better and better as technology evolves in it. There's a couple images here that I pulled off, and it just goes to show that the detail when you get your units dialed in and some of the cool things you can see under the water that's really never been seen before. So the main subjects that we're going to talk about, and you know, I kind of had some different ways that could have went with this as far as what we would cover, but I think the best thing is just talking about the different things you're going to find on fishing electronics, and that's going to be your chart, and we're going to talk about all the different settings and things that it's going to show you. Your traditional sonar, its uses, all its different applications, down imaging, side imaging, and then you couldn't do a fishing electronics class now without talking about forward-facing sonar. It's really took the fishing world by storm in the last 4 or 5 years, especially competitive fishing, and we're going to touch on a little bit of all these. So the first thing I want to talk about is what you would find as your chart or your graph on your depth finder or fish finder. And there is a ton of different things going on. You know, I kind of picked this screenshot out because it does represent a lot of those settings. So one, right off the bat, you're going to see that you can overlay different things like depth, time, your speed, your bearing. You could also overlay your temperature over this screen. You can put a lot of information out there, but there's a few things I want to point out. So one, there's a lot of different cartography out there. Different companies own them. You got Lake Master, you got Navionics, you got Garmin's, I think it's Active Captain, and they're steadily evolving with different versions with more detail, but you know, whichever one you choose, they all pretty much have some of the similar functions. One, just basic stuff is going to be your contour lines. You know, contours in water is very similar to topo maps on land, so therefore the closer the lines are together, the steeper the drop. One thing you can see here is, one, you have numbers around some of those contour lines to tell you depth, but then you also have some options to customize that and do some depth shading. So I can't really see exactly the depth they have shaded, but it looks to me like probably something like shade every depth on my chart between 9 and about 20 foot, it looks like, or 9 and 15 foot. So, you know, if I'm fishing, especially offshore, this time of year is a really good example, and I find fish consistently on the side of these drops or river channels between, let's say, 12 and 18 foot, well, I can go in and customize those settings and let my chart highlight just those depths. So that's one little trick. Also, you can see here they've got some red highlight that is, and I do the same thing in my boat. You're shading, you know, dangerous areas. So anything that's under 2 or 3 foot of depth, you can shade it red. And if you have some kind of a big, hump out in the middle of the river or something like that, you can avoid those things. Some other things around chart is almost all of them, especially if you fish like Kentucky Lake or Tennessee River system, you're going to have fluctuations in water level. And even from fall pool to summer pool, you're going to have a lot of fluctuations. So you can go in and set that chart on whatever water level it is to make these depths as accurate as possible. A few other things, you can see the boat pictured there that's kind of out in the center of that hump on the chart, but you can see the boat and there's a line drawn directly out the front of that boat. What that is like a heading line, and it can be, so in other words, if the boat turns or moves, that heading is always going to keep track of which way the boat is turned. Now there's a couple different settings. One, some of the older units, if you don't have an external GPS source, it kind of goes by movement, and that can get confusing, especially if you're floating backwards with the current and it predicts that you're moving backwards or heading backwards. It'll actually show the boat being faced the wrong direction. But there's a lot of external pucks out there, and when you're utilizing those, it really does always point to the direction that the boat is pointing, not necessarily moving. On this, you can also drop tracks, waypoints, all kinds of different stuff. And then if we go through some of this other stuff, the different types of imaging, everything is normally linked, trolling motor or different units. So if I passed, let's just say, we're going to talk about this later, but brim beds out on a big flat, and I scroll over on my side imaging and I drop a waypoint. As soon as that drops on that side imaging in that water column, on one screen, it's going to show up on my chart on the other. And then, of course, you could always just manually do one, just hit a waypoint and things like that. So any questions around chart, the settings around the cartography, anything like that? All right, if there's no questions there, we'll move ahead and we can always come back to any questions as they come to you. So the next thing I want to talk about is traditional sonar. And, if we think about what that is, it's just transmitting ultrasonic waves through a transducer that's mounted on the bottom of the boat. They reflect back from whatever, whether it be the bottom or, fish or different obstacles, and then it's captured again by that transducer. And the time that elapses between the transmission and the reception of that ultrasound is going to basically tell you the depth or the depth of the fish or whatever like that. So same principle really applies through all of these different things we're going to talk about, but this is probably the most primitive, basic thing. So when you're talking about traditional sonar, there's a couple different settings right off the bat that you have to consider. You can change your frequency in which those ultrasonic waves are transmitted. Lower frequency in general is going to be used in deeper water, and then higher frequency can be used in shallower water and can produce a little bit more detail. But kind of going back, it was in our poll questions, one of the ways that traditional sonar is a big benefit is because when you're talking about offshore fishing, anything over a 80 or 100 foot in depth, almost always going to see people using traditional sonar. Another couple little tidbits, and you can see it in this screenshot. You can see that hard reflection. So, the way I do run one of my units normally on a sonar split, because it's easy for me to tell when I'm going across the texture of different bottoms. So in other words, if I'm in mud, I can see it based on the color of that bottom. If I go across a shell bed, that frequency is going to be stronger. It's normally going to be darker in color, depending on what color formats you're using. So that's one thing I really like. And occasionally, you're going to be able to pick up some fish. I've seen it multiple times when they're positioned in certain ways. I can see them on sonar where I might not could see them on some of the other imaging. So we're going to talk about the benefits of that. Sonar, just like anything else, has got a ton of different color combinations. And I think, in my personal opinion, when you're using sonar along with the other stuff, finding the right color palette really makes a big difference on being able to identify what you're seeing on it. So the next one I want to talk about is down imaging. When we talk about down imaging, basically it is just a faster frequency of those same ultrasonic waves. Generally speaking, like this is a Humminbird Mega, so I can't remember exactly all the different hertz and megahertz and all that good stuff, but basically what this is it's shooting at about 1200 kilohertz, which is 1.2 megahertz, and that's compared to sonar shooting at like 455 kilohertz. So in other words, it's throwing a lot more beams out there. Because it's throwing more beams at a faster frequency and receiving them back into those transducers, you're able to paint a clearer picture of what it's seeing. And by doing that, I mean, you're really getting some crisp images. And also, along with, just kind of like sonar, when you've played with this stuff enough, you're really going to be able to see the color, bright colors when you're hitting on something hard. Prime example, if I go across shells or rocks, or you see these guardians around some of the yards at the lake that's got metal and concrete structures, and you're going to see a really bright repeat off of that. So just keep that in mind if some of the fishing that you're doing does depend on the type of bottom composition. So you can also see that on down. But basically, you're still shooting below the boat with down imaging. You're just shooting, really the biggest difference between down and sonar. One, it's got a little bit of different color palettes, but you're getting a lot more detail. So the next one I want to talk about is side imaging. Again, pictured here is a Humminbird, and going back kind of to what I talked about when I was talking about chart, you can overlay these depth, speed, temperature, time, all that as it changes through these different screenshots. Just know that you can add or remove whatever you want. So me, I'm running 2 units at the front and at the steering wheel, and I might run temperature and time on one, but then normally, like the screen that I'm using for down imaging and side imaging, I'm probably only going to put depth on there. I just want that as clutter-free as possible. But it's all about personal preference, just letting you know that is options to be added to any type of screen. So side imaging is just what it says. It's shooting from the side. But I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is really what they're looking at when they look at side imaging on a screen. So what you're seeing here is below the boat and to each side, left and right. This is set to 80 foot as a range. So what that means is it's shooting 13 foot down, and then in this case, 67 foot to each side. So that column that you see, that black column of water, is right directly under the boat. The things that you see on the bottom, at the end of that water column, is below the boat. And then from then on, it's to the right or to the left. So when you're on 80 foot, you're really only shooting the depth to the bottom and then the difference over. So if that makes sense for you. Now, you can set, I would give an example. If I was scanning on the side of a river channel, let's say I'm heading upstream and I'm on the right channel and I'm wanting to scan right on the side of it and I want a lot of clarity, I can swap to showing right only, or I can show side imaging left only. And these are all settings that you can adjust. You can also adjust your range. So in a situation where I'm scanning for, let's say, brim beds, or I'm looking for structure, or I know maybe about where something is, but I'm needing to find, maybe a rock or a rock pile or something like that, I can set my range at 100, 120 foot and make passes until I find that. Once I find it, either drop a waypoint or throw a buoy, whatever you prefer, lower my range or swap over to something like down imaging, and then go directly over the top of it with more detail. So there's a lot of different settings there. Any questions around any of those different types of, fish finder imaging before we go into a little bit of the setting stuff? Dustin asked, did you find these maps online? Yes, that is not something that come off of my graphs. I'm not sure of the reservoir that they were used on. Yeah, Scott asked a good question. Said with some of these awesome features, just talking about some of them being very pricey. So basically the way the pricing is going to work, your basic, let's say Humminbird, Fish Finder, Lowrance, something like that, is going to be chart and sonar. So that would be normally on Fish Finders your most basic thing. Now you can get sonar without chart, but for most practical purposes, that's where you're going to start. If you buy a unit that has, for instance, down imaging, then it's also going to have sonar and chart. Down imaging, sonar, chart. If you have a unit that has side imaging, then it will do side imaging, down imaging, sonar, and chart. So that's kind of the way they package it together. If you get the top tier of that, you get the other ones in there as well. That being said, where your pricing really goes up is in the size of the unit. Now, every manufacturer builds different models. Pictured here is a Helix model. They have some models that's a little bit better that has touch screens and things like that. So really there is a lot of different options with a lot of different price ranges. I'm personally running Helixes. They do everything I need them to do. They just don't have some of the fancier functions of some of the other ones, Onyxes and some of the more advanced technology out there. The biggest advantage to me when you're talking about size of screens is being able to run multiple screens at once. And I think we're going to talk about that here in the next couple slides. But, if I've only got a 5-inch or a 7-inch screen and I'm wanting to run my chart and down imaging and, be able to see it good and actually play with some of that stuff and some of the settings or drop waypoints or see fish, they're getting down pretty small when you start talking about half of a screen dedicated to one thing. So all that being said, they range anywhere from 5 and 7-inch models that's $200 or $300 to 19-inch models that's $3,000. Dustin asked some questions around clarity, and this is really where I'm at on this slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my settings, and I do adjust these settings pretty much every time I get on the water, and I'll talk through some of that stuff. And if that don't help you or answer your question, feel free to ask some more questions in detail. So we do have a question about the side imaging and said, is that view always sideways? So again, Yes, that is to the left. The one that I showed previously was to the left and to the right. And that is down to the bottom and then over to the right. And I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that if you're having problems with understanding how far something is beside you, you can also add grid lines that's going to tell you how far an object is. But for me, that never applies, because if I see something of interest there, I'm always going to drop a pin, or I'm going to take my cursor it over to that object, drop a waypoint, and then come back around for a better look, or move over there for a better look, if that makes sense. If you're only going to look at it and then try to make casts to it, those grid lines could come into play. And you guys, there was another question here about judging the height of objects off the bottom. And that can really be tough on side imaging. Again, let's say I see fish on side imaging, and you can see a school of bait fish to the left on this one. Looks like about 60 foot to your left. If I see that and I'm concerned with where they are in the water column, the depth in which they are in the water column, again, I can go over the top of them. Even if I keep it on side imaging, I can go over the top of them and have those show up in that black, what's currently black. In other words, the water column underneath the boat. Or I could swap over to my down imaging or sonar and go over the top of them. Then it's going to be easier for me to see the depth of them, or John, for your question, the height in which some of the structure and different things are off the bottom. And then one more question, and I don't mind to go back to this. Yeah. So what you're seeing here, the red is the hard bottom, and then some of these other things were fish. So we had a question around, said the sonar pic showed a red line and a big section of blue underneath. So what you're seeing is fish, then you're seeing the surface of the bottom, and then really, that underneath that, I think I see what you're saying now, that paler color underneath. I don't know that really plays a factor. Maybe it can just detect that there is a thin layer of shell or something like that it's not all the way through and through hard. Or it could just be the way this sonar was set up, and it kind of lost its penetrating power when it got to that shell surface on the bottom, or rocks, gravel, something like that. Good questions. I'm sorry, I think I've missed a couple because they wouldn't popping up out in the open on display here. So Scott asked a good question. Said, for those of us that have the basic fish finder, isn't the data that we're seeing behind us, since the transducer is mounted on the back? And that is true. So if you're seeing it, I couldn't tell you exactly the cone. I'm sure there is some degree of a cone that goes forward, but you're probably right. What you're seeing as soon as it enters the screen is probably at least midway down the boat, and getting ready to go behind you. So that is a really good point. There is some things that you can do as far as settings for chart speed. So like I keep mine set at about 2.5, 3, something like that. And there's a bunch of different opinions out there, but normally if I was using a trolling motor, I would probably slow it down. I generally, when I'm scanning, I'm using a motor at idle, and I'm normally idling around 3 miles per hour. So to my understanding, even though it don't say 2.5 miles per hour, the setting is like 2.5 as far as the chart speed. So there is some settings that you can play with there that will probably help you. And I keep going back to this, but whether if I was in a kayak or in a bass boat, it's not that important for me to see it right off the bat, as long as I can, drop a waypoint on it. Now, if you only have that, if you don't have chart, you don't have any kind of GPS on it, and you're basically scanning across it, then coming back to make casts at whatever you've seen, or maybe throwing a buoy, I would just advise you, as soon as it comes into the screen, throw that buoy behind the boat, and you know you're getting pretty close then. But that's probably going to be about the best you can do as far as keeping track of where that is. Michael asked a couple questions here. Do you ever use the auto fish detector for better identification? Yeah, on the older units, we definitely did do that, but I think that if you've got your settings dialed in correctly, even on something like this sonar screen, once you learn what you're looking at, I think you're going to be better off without something that's going to put that fish icon over it. And I think the reason why it could, let's say you come across a group of gizzard shad. We're bass fishing. We come across a group of gizzard shad that's big as your hand. Well, it probably would not be uncommon for that auto fish finder to detect that school of shad, and it might throw me off of them being bass or something like that. So I would probably, me personally, at least in once I got the feel of what I'm looking at, I would probably not use that, just so I could get a better idea of the size of the fish that it's marking. John asked a question, how does the speed affect the images of the fish, and how does the image change as your speed changes? I have seen situations where, let's say I have my chart speed up to like 3 or 4, where I was idling quick, and then I drop the trolling motor and I start trolling, and I get right over the top of a fish. I'm basically sitting still in the water, and it is basically continuously throwing that ultrasonic wave on the same fish without moving. That chart speed, that chart is still moving like I'm moving, but I'm not moving the boat. And it could cause that fish to maybe look larger than it is, or you'll kind of get some blurred imaging where it's trying to restart that cycle. But other than that, I don't see a lot of distortion. So if you're, once you kind of figure out your generalized speed, or whether you're trolling or idling at 2.5, 3 miles an hour, I think that's another good reason for kind of keeping it lower than what you normally idle. That way, if you are on a trolling motor and not going as fast, you're not going to get any kind of a false reading on your size and the clarity of your images, if that makes sense. These are really good questions, and they're really hard to answer virtually, but I hope that I'm doing a decent job of trying to explain some of the different things that you'll run into, which are doing awesome. Sue asked, I'm very new to using fish finders. What represents fish on the sonar? So you can see this, I still have this sonar imaging up. Basically, what I'm seeing is going to be a school of bait fish that is scattered through the water column on the left part of that screen. So you can see those as being kind of small. Some of the bigger ones do have a little bit more color in them. And basically, again, that dark color is reflected by hardness. So really, for the people that are really dialed in on this stuff, and your people that are fishing with sonar out in deep waters, really by the texture of the scales on the fish throwing off different colors, they can pretty much identify by the size, the shape, and the color and the density of the fish which species they're looking at. So I'm not near that far along, but just letting you know that the darker colors are bouncing off that hard scale of the fish, and that's probably a lot of why you're not seeing as darker red in those bait fish. They just don't have as dense of bodies. And then underneath that bait fish, it looks like a little bit bigger fish, and then on the right is going to be more your predatory fish in freshwater stuff. That would probably be bass or something like that. So, but really, I mean, it takes years and years to especially identify different species of fish, and I'm going to talk a little bit here in just a second about how those fish stack up and how different species present themselves in the water column. And I find that to be a lot bigger tale than looking at size or density or anything like that. So, but let's get back to a little bit of the settings. Really, As far as side imaging and down imaging, the settings are very similar. So one being sensitivity. So I know we have one question about getting clear images. If you have your sensitivity turned way up, you're going to see a lot of things in the water that are not there. You're just going to see little flakes across there. If you're in murky water, you're probably going to want to turn your sensitivity down. If you're in clearer water, you can probably turn your sensitivity up because there's not as much nutrients and algae and all the different things, mud that's in the water column. So that's a little bit. You can see here that really it goes down into the negatives. I think 0 is like basically a midline, and then you can go up and down from there. So it's kind of deceiving. DI enhance is another way for kind of like it's going to be like a contrast. Again, this is something you just need to play with, and really every time I put my boat in, even on the same bodies of water, I'll make a couple bumps on my screen to get my stuff clear. I don't want all those different statics in the background of my images. I want when something comes up in my water column on my units, it is an actual fish or a piece of structure or whatever. Now, by doing that, I probably am missing out on some small schools of bait fish or a individual brim here and there. But for what I'm trying to do, I'd rather have the clarity and the lack of confusion in my settings. And that's how I do it. I just keep my sensitivity a little lower. No doubt some people probably catch things that I miss, but they're also looking through a lot of stuff that just really don't exist. Chart speed. Again, this is where I was talking about, how you can change that, and then all the different color palettes. Again, there's a ton of different options. I just encourage you to get on the water one day and spend some time playing with these settings. And, one thing I do a lot of the time, let's just say you've got a fish attractor buoy, or you've got even a no wake buoy out in the water. Well, I know there's an anchor underneath there, a rope and then an anchor. And if I'm wanting to really test my units, go drive over or kayak over those different things that something's on the bottom, or you have a good idea of what's there. Maybe you've seen it when the water was down and now the water's up, and test yourself. So go across it, see what it looks like, change your settings, drive back over it. And I do that all the time. I've often had the idea that if you could sell basically a fish decoy that's a 5-pound bass, and you could attach it to a weight and drop it down and, be able to drive over it and see what that fish looks like on those units, it would probably sell for people trying to get started on understanding what they're looking at on their units. But so the next thing I wanted to cover was just a combination of screens, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about, size and different settings and all this different stuff. If you've got a pretty good size unit, you can do several different splits and get a different picture painted in different ways all at one time. And that's kind of what you see here. This guy's got his chart on. He can see his depth on it. He can see his route, which is very important. And then also he's able to scan on side imaging and sonar all at the same time. So really, depending on what you're trying to accomplish and what you're fishing for, your budget, different things like that, it really is going to dictate the type of unit you're going to buy and the different kind of imaging that you're going to want. So just letting you know what's out there, and know that you can get by on one unit and be able to just split this, the unit up. So the very next thing is forward-facing sonar, and this has took the world by storm the last 4 or 5 years in competitive fishing, and these guys that really know how to use it, they can tell you not only what species of fish, but also the size down to a few ounces. As far as settings go, you're going to see a couple different things. Basically, like playing a video game in a lot of ways once you kind of understand what you're doing. But basically, we're looking at a 20-degree cone angle. It would kind of be like shining a flashlight under the water. At 20-degree cone pointed forward, you're getting at 30 foot out, you're seeing about 5 foot each side of the center line. So you're seeing 10 foot wide, 30 foot out. And then you can adjust your range, and you can adjust what basically equates to sensitivity, and it's called gain. So in murkier water, you might want to turn your gain down. If it's clear, you might turn it up. It's all kind of personal preference. Again, one of those things, you play with that, and you could have a little bit of, you could have a really clear screen, but miss some objects out there, or you could turn it up and be more sensitive and probably have a little more static that you have to dig through. So it really does come down to personal preference there. Dustin has some questions around basic sonar and down imaging frequency. I'm going to say, so my question, are those sonar and down imaging using the same frequency? Down imaging should be shooting at a faster frequency, and you're going to be able to go in and change those frequencies in each individual setting. So if you change your, from let's say sonar to down imaging, you're going to be able to adjust inside that one. And, you can adjust, I mentioned down imaging shooting at 1.2 megahertz, but you can adjust it down to 700 or 800 kilohertz. And it kind of goes back to that same principle as using it in deeper water and things like that. But I hope that answered your question. I think that I see what you're saying. You only have one transducer, so you would assume that those frequencies are the same, but they're not. That frequency, to my knowledge, is able to do two things at once. And I hope that answered your question. So any questions around forward-facing sonar? We could spend the whole hour just talking about it, but I just hate to get too far into the weeds on it. I just want you to know that it does exist. It mounts, generally the transducer will mount on the trolling motor, or you can have its own separate pole to adjust it. If you put it separate, it gives you a little bit more room to be able to point it in whichever direction you want. Where if you had it mounted on the trolling motor, you're going to have to turn that trolling motor to look in that direction, if that makes sense. Yep. Question around waypoints. Waypoints is just a saved point on the map. Also, all your charts now have different icons. So let's say that I scroll over on my down imaging, or I pass over a sandbar on my chart, whatever situation, and I hit that waypoint function, it's going to give me an option of different icons. So it could be a rock symbol. It could be an anchor symbol. It could be a fish symbol. It could be a different species of fish symbol. They are very detailed now. You can save favorites. So where when you hit that waypoint function, it pops up 5 favorites. If whatever you're wanting is not in the 5 or 10 favorites, then you could go to other and then pick out something different. Me personally, I'm normally in a hurry, or think I am. So I want to be able to real quickly come across School of Fish, hit my waypoint button. It's going to pop up my favorites. I'm going to hit just a generic fish icon. I'm going to move on. Or I keep a couple different ones, one being like rocks. If you're fishing for smallmouth and things like that, that would be one. I also keep like a stump or a tree lap, something like that is another icon. So a lot of options out there. I would, again, recommend you just hit that button and look at all your different options and kind of play with that. Scott asked, talking about the forward-facing sonar. So at 20-degree cone, at 60 foot, you got to think it's constantly getting bigger, just like a flashlight beam. So 20-degree cone, it's a third of the distance. So at 30 foot, you're seeing 10 foot. At 60 foot, you're seeing 20. And then you have to divide by 2 as far as both sides of the center line, if that makes sense. Lewis asked a good question. Is there a SOS but or said, what is the SOS button for? I think actually what mine is called is like a man overboard, MOB, I think is what it is on my, and it's an actual button on my main screen. But that's what it would be. It would be, it's just to mark real quickly, you've been able to hit a button and mark where somebody fell out or something like that for an emergency. To my knowledge, there could be a way to have it linked to your phone and it actually calls for, emergency assistance or something like that, but I'm not aware of anything like that. To my knowledge, it's just basically dropping that waypoint for you to be able to come back to an emergency situation. Kelvin asked the question, is forward-facing sonar the new standard, or do you recommend buying one now or giving it time to get better? I mean, for the people that can use it, it is already really good. It's always going to get better. It's crazy the detail out there. It just really comes down to what you're doing. It is pricey. To be able to effectively run it, you really need to run it on its screen of its own. And then by the time you buy the transducer and everything that comes along with it, you're probably going to be, $2,500, $3,000 deep. So if you're not competitive fishing for bass or, crappie fishing every weekend or something like that, maybe you can't justify it, but it really does just come down to personal preference. But as far as the technology, it has come so far, you're never going to have the best. I've learned that in this world of fishing electronics. By the time you buy it and get it installed on your boat, the competitive in the market has already created something that makes yours obsolete. I can just tell you. So at some point you just have to, if it's something you're wanting on your boat or you're wanting to try out, just go get it and run it and learn how to use it. And then you'll be that much further ahead if it does have some, technological advancements. Matthew asks, are you able to remove a waypoint that was inserted? Yep, you can do that. And then as far as the waypoints go, most all of these units can be connected to the trolling motor. And one other function that's worth mentioning is if I'm idling around and for whatever reason, maybe I'm at my console and I don't want to walk to the front, you can go to most of your units if it's connected to your trolling motor and do like a boat to waypoint, or click the waypoint and say boat to, and it will take the trolling motor and automatically go to that waypoint. It's almost like a cruise control. And that's a pretty neat feature if you're running like Minn Kota trolling motor and Humminbird depth finder or Lowrance trolling motor, Lowrance depth finders. But I did want to just show a little bit of some imaging of things you might see on your unit and then what they mean. So this is brim beds. This is on side imaging. You can see we're in 2.5 foot of water. The water column, because of that, is kind of narrow on both sides of the left and right, the black portion I referred to. And then you can actually see these honeycomb shaped places where brim are bedding. So the black spot is an individual brim bed, and then inside some of those brim beds, you can actually see the brim laying there, if you can see those little bit brighter colors in there. And to give you perspective of what you're looking at, there is one looking with the bare eye. So we can go back, you're just seeing that honeycomb shape. And this is one of the biggest advantages for a pan fisherman with side imaging. Being able to find these brim beds, and not, it's not just brim that bed, bass bed, every fish spawns, but to me, the way they cluster their beds together, it makes it easier to pinpoint these brim. So that's one thing we could use it for. Brush, other structure underneath the surface, you can really easily see that. Fish around those brush piles, and then you can see a little difference. You see how sharp that reflection is underneath that brush pile of that bottom. It's kind of a little bit higher hump, like shells or something, compared to the right side of the screen. So it almost looks like you got brush piles on like a shell bed or a gravel bed, and then you kind of go back into mud and sand. So that's some things I see when I look at that. And then this kind of goes back to talking about identifying different fish. And, this is a great time to be covering this because, a lot of fish in the summertime, when the water temperature gets really high, they're looking for different, like a thermocline in the water where the oxygen is. They can't live in 2 foot of water where, the water temperature is 82, 84 degrees and get enough oxygen. So a lot of those bigger fish especially are pulling out in the deeper water. And this is a great time to target schools of bass. Things I'm looking for, and I don't have a picture of like crappie positioned in the water column, but when I'm looking at bass in deep water, normally they're going to be stacked horizontally and pretty close to the bottom. If you see fish staggered all through the water column from 6 inches deep all the way to the bottom, good chance it's not going to be bass. It's probably going to be either some kind of a shad or carp or something like that. Sometimes if you find structure similar to those brush piles, you can see those fish that are stacked vertically in the water column. There's obviously some bait fish, real small stuff, but a lot of times when you're looking at crappie, they're going to be stacked more like a Christmas tree. They're going to be stacked more vertical in the water column. So as you fish, I'm just telling you some things to pay attention to, and through experience, you're going to be able to put 2 and 2 together. If you come across a school and you take note of the way they're positioning themselves in the water, you turn around, you throw at them, you catch bass or you catch crappie, just pay attention to that because that will help you in learning to identify different species. Scott asked a question, do these GPS units have a maintain feature? So the unit is only going to drop a coordinate or a waypoint, which should be plenty for you to be able to consistently go back to that spot or stay on that spot, but you're going to have to use your trolling motor to do it. But I think what you're asking about is going to be more of a trolling motor function, and it's called spot lock. This is a button. It's represented by a anchor icon on mine. I run a Minn Kota, and when I hit that, the GPS that's built into the trolling motor is going to be what holds you within, let's say, 5 square foot of a GPS coordinate. So I can, even in current, wind, whatever, I can spot lock down and stay in that particular spot. But again, that's more of a trolling motor function than it is a unit of fish finder function. But that's a very good question. Just defining the word structure, said, are we talking about logs, rocks underneath? Correct. And structure, in my opinion, is just a generic term for just what you said: logs, stumps, rocks, collapsed docks, man-made fish attractant structures. Structure is just basically anything under the water column. And it don't really relate to fishing electronics, but just thinking about why structure is important. Structure, one, acts as current breaks for fish. They can get in behind it, nose into it. They don't have to spend a lot of energy to stay in one spot. They can use it for ambushing prey fish, and then prey fish like shad and brim and things like that actually go to that structure because once it's underwater for a certain amount of time, especially in the summer with the water temperature up, it's going to start to collect algae and different little microbes on it, in which those fish are going to come feed on. So that draws bait fish, which draws bigger fish, and it's just kind of a underwater niche there that we look for as fishermen. A bunch of questions here. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights. We're right here at 7:30. Yeah, Lewis did ask some questions about the shadow, and this is side imaging. So this picture on the right is side imaging right only, and I mentioned that earlier, but that is what you're seeing. That fish is creating a shadow, And there was a question earlier about identifying how far something is off the bottom. I still recommend, if you're wanting detail on how far something is off the bottom on side imaging, to mark it and go back over the top of it with down imaging or sonar. It's going to give you a better idea of what you're looking at, but that shadow can play a pretty big factor as far as identifying it just on side. So just looking at some of these different fish, I see short shadows behind those fish, which probably is going to mean to me they're close to the bottom. If I see a long shadow or a gap between the fish and the shadow, I know that they're probably a little bit more suspended in the water column. I hope that answers that question. Sue asked, should you be able to see fish with this 30 in murky water? Yeah. Yeah, if you got things dialed in correctly, you shouldn't really, unless it's just post-flood brown as chocolate milk, you're probably going to be able to deal with your settings and be able to get pretty close to some good clarity. David asked a question about kind of using artificial intelligence to identify what's out there and what you're looking at or looking for. And to my knowledge, there's not anything currently there out there, but probably will be before long. And I've really skipped over a lot of the pairing. You can pair your phone with these things. You can make phone calls. You can listen to the radio. I mean, it really is endless. So to think that it can tie in and use Google or something like that to help interpret or help different things on there, it's probably certainly a possibility, but I'm unaware at this time. Really good questions. So we're right here at 7:30. I'm going to go ahead and pop these post class polls up. Take just a second to knock that out, and then I'll stick around as long as I need to and answer any questions you guys have. I just want to at least do this, so whoever needs to go at 7:30 can. All right, thank you guys for that. Looks like almost everybody has got that stuff correctly, 87%. Choosing advantage of traditional sonar, it works well in deep water, and that's why you see a lot of your people fishing offshore and in salt water that's still using traditional sonar. And then when scanning for brim beds, which type of imaging is preferred? It's side imaging, just because you can cover so much water in one swath there when you're idling around or paddling around, letting that imaging out to 100, 120 foot, and you can find those brim beds real easy. So appreciate you guys doing that. But now, any other questions you guys have, feel free. I'll stick around. If you do have enjoyed the virtual classes and you feel inclined to donate to help us advertise for these and make them better, there's a QR code to donate, and then you can sign up for the next virtual classes, which actually starts our next fiscal year next week. We got 2 more this week, and then we're really starting over with a bunch of new things out there. I will mention that the one that I don't even know that we've got a registration link for it yet, but you'll be seeing that Sunday. All the field reps will be on, and we're going to do a little preview to what the next fiscal year is going to bring over the fall and winter. And it's also kind of a catch-all for our end of year closing, and any questions on anything we've covered, feel free to join and interact with us on that. So that being said, I'll stick around and answer any questions I can. But for you guys that's jumping off, man, y'all are really interactive. That's what really makes these things great. And thanks for all the great questions. We're coming to an end, but I appreciate you guys joining. Try to stay cool this evening. Get out there and catch some fish this weekend. So thanks, guys.